Hey guys, Eric here at 4Up Gaming, and today I want to talk about part 3 of getting started with Kings of War. In this segment, we're going to focus mostly on basing, the differences between singular basing and multi-basing, and we're also going to talk about some very basic painting techniques. If that stuff interests you, then please stay tuned. Alright guys, so as I mentioned, pretty much what we're going to focus on today is stuff for your beginners, the people that are just getting into Kings of War, or any mass battle game, or any game where you have models for that sense. And what we're going to try and do is turn the armies of gray plastic, right, this wonderful gray plastic, into something that is actually painted. Alright, now I am not an expert painter in any sense of the word or stretch of the imagination. I am most definitely not. But I do like to have a painted army on the board. It definitely does look good. Especially looks good for you guys when you're watching our battle reports and you see painted stuff on the table. It definitely looks great, right? Now, none of us at 4Up Gaming are master painters or anything like that, but we definitely use some tried and true techniques, and they're very basic techniques. You don't have to be a respectable painter or a very good painter in order to have a great looking army on the tabletop. The best thing I can say is, go with the basics, and I'll definitely show you guys those basics here. First thing we're going to look at is going to be primer. You want to make sure that you use a good primer on there, and when you're putting your primer down, you want to make sure that you are a good distance away from your model. So guys, like I mentioned before in another video, there are really two different ways of spray painting and assembling your models. One, you can assemble the model before you spray paint, and two, you can leave the models on the sprues. Here I've done both just to show you guys kind of the differences. Obviously the battle standard bearer is already built and I have them on the left, and then I have sprues of some clansmen that I'm going to be painting on the right. So as you can see, you want to put a nice even coat. You want to be far enough away from the models. You don't want to put your paint too heavy on the model because you don't want to have the primer kind of start to glob into the recesses, and you don't want it to glob into all the detail that the sculpt has. This is definitely something you don't want to do. Once you're done getting the one side, you're going to let it dry. Typically with this Rust-Oleum that I use, it takes about 10-15 minutes outside for it to dry. And then you want to flip everything over. That way you ensure that you get a nice even primer on both sides. Now I use a Rust-Oleum flat finish. I don't like to use the glossy on primer. I guess if you want to, you can use glossy, but I don't. Make sure again that when you are painting these, that you are spray painting them far enough away, again, where you're not globbing up the model with a whole bunch of paint to where it gets rid of all the details. This is especially apparent on the older Mantic sculpts where the details are very, very subtle. Make sure you guys don't do that. Otherwise, it obviously will get rid of some of the detail. So here we go. We have the model ready to go. We're going to go ahead and start painting it now. The primer's on there pretty good. It's not chipping off. It's not, hasn't pooled up anywhere. You want to make sure that you have a good primer coat, because if your primer coat isn't good, then the rest of your paint is not going to go on there very well. So I'm going to start with some Citadel paint. I know I actually prefer Army Painter, but some stuff from Citadel is pretty good. I like their bleached bone. Here's some fur brown from the Army Painter, and then I got some more Citadel chainmail. And I'm going to go ahead and start putting the first coat on this guy. I have a couple different brushes that I'm going to use. Obviously you can tell one is more of a fine tip and the other one's more of a coarse tip, and that really makes a difference. This right here is my painting pot. It's just old silicone like ice cube tray that I didn't like to use for ice cubes, and it works pretty well as a painting pot. You start out with very little paint on the paintbrush. Don't load up your paintbrush with a whole bunch of paint. See how thick or thin the paint goes on, and then adjust. If you need to water it down a little bit, go ahead and do so. Typically with Citadel paints, they go on pretty thick, but you don't really have to water them down too much. Their pigment isn't very strong, at least not with the bleached bone. So I'm going to start to paint all of what I believe to be the garments that the battle standard bearer used to wear. And a lot of this is really just for shading. I'm not really doing this so that the color comes through. I'm just doing this for shading. And this kind of brings me to a main topic here with the paint job that I'm doing on this guy. He is obviously an undead standard bearer here. And so with that, he's going to look dirty. He's going to look like he just came up out of the grave. He's not going to look clean cut. And so I know that when I'm doing the paint job. And so if I mess up a little bit, if I you know, paint too heavy or too light on something, it's probably going to actually work for the shading and the contrast later on. So you don't really have to be too accurate. The undead is really a good army to start out with painting because, again, you can make some mistakes, and as long as you throw some dark tone or a dark wash on it, it's probably going to look okay. But either way, you want to make sure that you go through. I like to paint with one color of paint, get everything I'm going to paint with that color before I switch to a different color of paint. So what I mean is, if I'm going to paint stuff bleached bone, I go through the whole model, paint everything that I'm going to paint bleached bone, and then I switch to the other colors, as I'm doing here. So I find that with metallics, you definitely want to use a little bit more paint than you normally would. Metallics tend to look kind of creamy, I guess, kind of runny. And so I like to make sure that I put a liberal amount of paint on there with metallics. They like to run a little bit. Now with, again, with the undead, that's going to look okay because it's going to look like it's a little bit faded, or maybe it's not the best quality of metal out there. And so that actually kind of works, again, for the undead's favor. But as you can see, you know, it doesn't look perfect right now. I'm merely just going through and just roughly painting what I think certain colors should be and going from there. All right, guys, this is the not so secret secret of painting, especially undead models, and that is the quick shades or washes, whichever you want to call them. Now with the undead, I typically like to use a strong tone or a dark tone because, again, these guys have just come up out of the ground, right? They've come up out of a grave, and so they're not going to look clean. They're not going to look nice and polished, and you know, the metal's not going to look beautiful. So I like to get some dark tone or strong tone, and then go over the model with it. And you know, just what's nice about the washes is, unless you are trying to highlight or low light a specific area, just put it all over the model. And just do that. It doesn't really matter. You can be as liberal with it or as stingy with it as you want, depending on how thick of a wash that you want. I will say, though, that you know, I would wait until it completely dries before you decide to put on another coat or two. That is always a big thing. Now, what you also want to do once you're done applying the coat of quick shade is you want to make sure that you dab the pools of the quick shade where it's pooled up on your model. You want to make sure that you dab some of those pools off. Otherwise, they will pool together and dry that way, and it might not look right on the model. Now, after I have made sure to get all the recesses of the quick shade out of there, I'll kind of look and see if I've missed any place, and if I have, I'll make sure to take care of that. Alright guys, so what I like to do with my armies is I like to paint something on the model and keep it in the same theme as the rest of the army. So for example, with the Battle Standard Bearer, I am going to paint the skull green. And that's because the rest of my army, all my undead units, I have something in them or on them that's painted green. The only exception is the werewolves. But other than that, I have everything in there. There's something, whether it be the banner or a shroud of clothing or something that is green, and that kind of helps pull the army together. And even though they look different, they all still look the same, really. You know, there's at least some concentric theme going there. I like to use colors for that to either denote different units or to denote different armies, in fact. And so what's nice about this is I can mix and match. I can pull a unit from this army, add another unit to the army, and it still looks like it matches. So another thing that you want to make sure you do is after the tone or the shade, quick shade, whatever you want to call it, has dried, you want to make sure to go back over the model and maybe add some highlighting in some areas that you really want that article of clothing, that sash, the whatever it is, to kind of pop through. Sometimes if you put the dark tone on there, sometimes it might actually be a little too heavy on it, and so it's okay to go back in and just kind of add a little bit of coloring to help make that pop again. Highlighting is always great. You know, I typically try and use a shade similar to the color that I painted. So if I'm using a green color, I like to use a lighter shade for that to kind of help bring that highlighting out on those articles of clothing here, or whatever it is. So now I'm going to dry brush a little bit. I'm going to use some bleached bone at first, and then I'm going to use a little bit of a little bit of a white, Vallejo white. I like to use bleached bone because it's not going to come across too bright on the skeleton, because again, we want them to still kind of look dirty, but I want some detail to really pop. And so you can see here, you know, you can see his sash, you can see the chainmail, but it all still kind of looks like he just came out of the ground. Yes, the shield looks kind of shiny, but you know, I kind of like the metallics to stick out a little bit. I don't want them to be too dull. So now what we're going to do is do the actual base of the model. Because this model is on a 20mm base, and that is what he's supposed to be based as. He's a singular unit. He doesn't go into, you know, he's not part of a troop or a regiment. I'm going to go ahead and base him by himself and just keep him on the base. I'm not going to clip him off of his base or anything. So I used werewolf fur, and I like to get a nice dark brown coating, and that's specifically for this type of basing. This is a very simple basing technique. You start out, once the paint is dried, then you just get a little bit of Elmer's clear glue. It's like $2.79 at Hobby Lobby, but you can get it anywhere. I don't know if you guys have Hobby Lobbies near you or not, but any hobby store or arts and crafts store is going to have this stuff. I like the clear glue because it dries clear, and so you don't have to worry about weird discoloration or anything like that. Now, you don't want to use too much glue, but you want to use enough to where it is going to hold the sand and the grit well. If you use too little, it's not going to pick up a lot of it. If you use too much, it's going to look like he's traipsing through a bunch of snow, and it's just not going to look good. So you got to find that happy medium there. And then move the glue around on the base. I like to use a crappy brush. In this case, it's just a brush that I use to highlight with anyway, or to dry brush with. And I like this to kind of get that glue. I don't want to have the glue on the model. I want to have it on the base, but I want to have it nice and evenly spread out because I want there to be texture and sand evenly spread out over the base. So from here, we're going to dip the model into just some basic playground sand. This stuff I got at Home Depot. I think I got a 10-pound bag of it for like $3. So don't overspend on it, guys. Just want to make sure that you have a combination of small, fine pieces and kind of, you know, mid-sized pieces. You don't want it all to be the same size because it's not going to look natural. And I like to just dip the base in there, kind of get as much of it on there as I possibly can, sit it in there for a little bit, and then pull the model out. You want to make sure you shake off as much of the excess sand as you can. But if it doesn't look like you got enough on there, you know, dip that in there as much as you need. And you can do this multiple times if you need to after it dries. So moving on from there, once we have all of the sand off there, we want to let this sit and dry for a couple hours. Elmer's glue does take a little bit longer to dry. It just depends on what you're using. If it's rubber cement or something else, it just really depends. I like to, before it dries all the way though, I like to also try and remove any excess amount, or if it's pooling around a model's, you know, foot or something like that, I like to remove some excess stuff. Anything that doesn't look natural. All right, so this is what it looks like. It still doesn't look great, and it still needs one more coat of paint on that base to really make it all look a little bit better. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some werewolf fur again, and we are just going to paint that all. We're going to paint all of the sand and grit and all of that stuff brown, just like we did with the original base. Once that is done, we're going to hit it with a little bit of a dry brush. I like to use just Vallejo white for basing. We're just going to, with dry brushing, you want to load up your paintbrush with some paint, and then you're going to take a paper towel and you're going to remove as much of that paint as possible. I know it seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's kind of what you want to do. And then that's just going to leave just a little bit of paint still on your paintbrush. That way you get some nice highlighting, but it doesn't overpaint the base. You just want it to look like there's some lighting, you know, hitting some of the grit and sand and gravel, whatever he's walking on, and you want it to just kind of stand apart from the model itself. So here's a shot of it from before, and here is what the finished product looks like. You know, it's not going to win any awards or anything like that, but you know what? It's going to look pretty darn good on the tabletop. It's going to look good next to my Legion of Zombies that I have right there. I wanted to show you guys kind of what a bigger unit would look like with this multi-basing, or with this basing technique. I did the exact same technique on this base here. I put glued the sand and gravel down, and then painted it brown, and then dry brushed it white. So this is what it will look like, you know, in a bigger scale, and not just a singular model. This is also a multi-based Legion. So those of you that are out there that are wondering about multi-basing or singular basing, this is what you can do with multi-basing. It looks kind of cool. It has a nice little diorama feel to it, and it definitely beats having to pick up 60 zombie models, because I believe 60 is what you need for a Legion now. So real quick, I am going to show another technique. This is using a sculpting clay and a rolling pin, and that right there is a sample of what the clay looks like. I like to use a medium blend clay, and I like to use this for basing sometimes, depending on what I'm basing, instead of the sand and grit and gravel. It looks complicated, guys, but it's pretty easy. You start with your basic surface, whatever you're going to use, a movement tray, your piece of MDF, plastic card, whatever you're using. You put your sculpting clay onto the surface, and then you roll out with the pin, just like so, and it puts a nice little imprint into the clay. And this can definitely look cool. If you guys haven't checked out greenstuffworld.com, definitely check them out. They have some really cool stuff in there, and some really cool different rolling pin designs. So here's an example. This is a troop of elves, and you can see that runic base that I have on there. That's from using the rolling pin. Now this looks a little bit rough because it's supposed to be an old temple floor that has, you know, been in decay a little bit, and so I wanted it to look a little bit dirty and rough, but that's kind of gives you an idea of just another alternative you can do for basing. Now this stuff does have a couple more steps in it. You actually do have to, once you get the sculpting clay put onto the base, you do have to put it into the oven for a little while and cure it. Alright guys, if you're going to multi-base, this is the easiest way to do it. I like to paint the model up first onto the base, and then I just clip the feet off, or as close to the bottom as I can, and then I stick it right onto the movement tray. That is all you really have to do in order to turn a singular based model into a multi-base model. I would definitely paint them first while they're still on their base originally, before you put them onto a movement tray, if that's what you're going to do. Guys, multi-basing is an awesome thing that Mantic Games lets us do for Kings of War. So there's a troop of elves there that's multi-based, and this is a regiment of orc gore riders. I'm sorry, these guys are not fully painted yet. This is an army that I'm working on. But these guys are singularly based, and as you can tell, there are 10 models. They all have their own individual base. Now, I understand that this is the way we all used to play rank and flank games, especially Warhammer Fantasy Battles. We used to just line up all of our models onto a movement tray, and then as they died, we would pull the models off one at a time. Well, luckily with Kings of War, you don't have to do that, and so you don't have to have all of the models on the base at the same time. So a regiment of orc gore riders is 10 models, right? But you don't have to do that if you multi-base. You only need to do, I think it's 80% now, or 70 to 80%. So I usually try and do 80%, so I'll do 8 models. And then I will put them into a troop format, kind of like this right here. I have eight elves on there, and a troop is supposed to be 10 elves. What's nice about multi-basing though is I have them all on the same base. I can pose them in certain ways. It looks much more dynamic. I can also then put them with another troop, and now I have a regiment. You know, it's pretty easy to put them all together. And then if I want to take them apart and use them as troops, I can definitely do that. You know, it's a nice little modular way of doing this. All of the movement trays and everything that I have here, all the bases are from Ironheart Artisans. So they make some great stuff. Make sure you guys check them out if you haven't already. But some of the pros and cons to multi-basing, you know, one of the pros is that with multi-basing, I don't have to worry about the models falling off. You know, I don't have to worry about somebody hitting my horde and then all of a sudden I got to play 40 elf pickup, which is nice. You know, I can still move them around and do different things with them. You know, I don't really have to worry about keeping them stationary or anything like that. What's also nice is if you multi-base them right, you can use them for troops, regiments, or hordes depending on what your army, what you want to do with your army. Now, the singular basing is nice because if you want to use those models for other game systems, you can easily do that. But as you can see, you know, with singularly basing them, you move that base around a little bit, or you move the movement tray around a little bit, and they all start sliding everywhere. And it just, to me, just doesn't look as cinematic. It's nice to be able to not have to worry about your models falling or dropping, or if you're moving from one table to the next, you know, and somebody bumps your arm, that your 120 dudes are going to fall off. So, you know, it really just depends, I guess, on what you want to do. If you want to use models for Vanguard, or you want to still use models for other game systems that may require you to keep them singularly based, I totally understand that, and luckily you can do that with Mantic models. But if not, this is a great alternative, and I definitely support multi-basing. But either way, guys, as long as you have an army that looks good on the tabletop, that's all that's going to matter. Well, guys, that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Please let us know if you guys enjoyed it or not, and if you guys have any other questions, comments, anything like that, please let us know. If you do enjoy the content that we're putting out on the channel, then please consider subscribing and hit the like button as well. We definitely look at your guys' comments, so please let us know what you guys want to see from us next. Have a good night, guys.